Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's story is one that will touch your heart in ways you don't expect. It's about grief, about second chances, and about how sometimes the people we think have nothing are carrying the most love of all. Every year on the same cold morning in November, Richard Hale visited the cemetery before the sun came up. He didn't like being seen, he didn't like sympathy, and he definitely didn't like questions. Richard was one of the wealthiest men in the state, a self-made billionaire who built his empire from a single warehouse and a stubborn refusal to quit. People admired his discipline, his sharp mind, his ruthless decisions in business. But no one ever saw him as soft. No one ever imagined he could be broken. But he was. 3 years earlier, his 8-year-old daughter, Emily, had died in a car accident. A rainy night, a distracted driver, a phone that buzzed at the wrong time. And just like that, his entire world collapsed into silence. He built hospitals after that, donated millions to road safety campaigns, funded scholarships in her name. The world called him generous. The media called him resilient. But none of it filled the empty bedroom in his mansion. None of it replaced the small pink backpack still hanging by the door. None of it quieted the echo of her laugh that lived in his mind. That morning, as he stepped out of his black car, the sky was still gray. His driver stayed behind, knowing better than to follow. Richard preferred to walk the narrow stone path alone. He carried white lilies, Emily's favorite dot, as he approached her grave. He slowed down because someone was already there at first. He thought it was just another early visitor, someone who had mistaken the grave. But as he got closer, he saw a man kneeling by the headstone. His clothes were simple, slightly worn, a janitor's uniform. Beside him stood a small girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, clutching a faded teddy bear, and the man was crying, not quietly, not politely. He was sobbing like someone whose heart had been ripped open. Richard froze. Anger rose in his chest. This was private. This was sacred. This was his daughter's resting place. He stepped forward, his voice cold and sharp. "What are you doing here?" The man flinched and quickly wiped his face. He stood up, placing a protective hand on the little girl's shoulder. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice trembling. "We didn't mean any disrespect." "This is my daughter's grave," Richard replied. "Why are you here?" The little girl looked up at Richard with wide, frightened eyes. She squeezed the teddy bear tighter. The man hesitated. He looked down at the headstone again. The engraved name, Emily Hale. "She saved my daughter," he whispered. Richard blinked. "What?" 3 years ago, the man continued, swallowing hard. "There was an accident. My wife and we were hit by a truck. My wife didn't make it. My daughter survived." Barely. Richard felt the air shift around him. "She needed emergency surgery." The man said, "We didn't have insurance. I work as a janitor at the city hospital. I clean floors, empty trash bins. That's all I've ever done. I didn't have the money." The little girl looked up at her father. "Then we found out someone had anonymously covered the cost. All of it. The surgeries, the therapy, the medication." Richard's heart began to pound. Later, the man said, his voice breaking again, "A nurse told me it was funded by a foundation, created in memory of a little girl who died in a car accident that same night." He pointed gently to the name on the stone. "Your daughter." Richard couldn't speak. The janitor knelt again, brushing his fingers lightly over the engraved letters. "I come here every year," he said, "to say thank you, because my daughter is alive today. Because of her." The little girl stepped forward, shyly. "I brought her flowers," she said in a small voice. In her tiny hands were 2 slightly crushed daisies. Richard stared at them. Emily had loved daisies too. He felt something crack inside his chest, something he had kept sealed tight for 3 years. "What's your name?" he asked the little girl. "Lily," she replied. Richard swallowed hard. For a moment, none of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees. The world felt very still. "I didn't know," Richard finally said. "I didn't know anyone, specifically." The man nodded. "You weren't supposed to. It was anonymous. But I had to find out. I had to know who saved my child." Richard looked at the little girl again. She was alive, breathing, standing there because of a choice he had made in the darkest night of his life. He remembered that night so clearly. After leaving the hospital where Emily's body lay, he had walked into his office and signed a stack of papers without even reading them. "Make sure no parent ever feels what I'm feeling because they can't afford care," he had told his assistant. He never followed up. He couldn't bear to. And now here was the proof. "Does she remember?" Richard asked quietly. "No," the janitor said. "She was too young. But I remember." Every day, the little girl stepped closer to the grave and gently placed the daisies down. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard turned away abruptly, pretending to look at the horizon. His vision was blurry. For 3 years, he had believed Emily's death had only brought pain. But standing there, he realized something else had grown from that tragedy. Life. He looked at the janitor. "What's your name?" "Miguel," the man replied. "Miguel," Richard said slowly. "What shift do you work?" "Night, sir." Richard nodded. "Do you like it?" Miguel gave a small, embarrassed smile. "It's honest work." Richard studied him for a long moment. I'd like to offer you something, he said. Miguel stiffened. Sir, we don't want charity. We just came to say thank you. It's not charity, Richard replied. It's an opportunity. He paused, choosing his words carefully. My foundation is expanding. We need someone who understands what it means to struggle. Someone who remembers what these families feel like. I need someone real. Miguel looked stunned. You'd give me a job. I'd give you training, Richard corrected. Education. A position. If you earn it. Lily looked up at her father. Does that mean we can help other kids? Miguel's eyes filled with tears again. Richard felt his throat tighten. Yes, he said softly. That's exactly what it means. Weeks passed. Miguel began attending evening classes funded by the foundation. He worked harder than anyone expected. He asked questions no executive had ever asked. Questions about how forms were written, about how scared parents felt in waiting rooms, about how confusing medical bills looked when you didn't understand half the words. Richard found himself listening, really listening. For the first time in years, he visited the foundation offices not out of obligation, but because he wanted to see the work being done. Sometimes, Lily came to. She would sit in the corner with coloring books while her father attended meetings. She reminded Richard so much of Emily that it hurt, but it also healed. One afternoon, Lily wandered into Richard's office. She held up a drawing. It was a picture of 3 people standing under a bright sun. One tall man, one smaller man, and a little girl between them, all holding hands. That's you, she said, pointing to the tallest figure. And that's my daddy, and that's me. Richard felt his chest tighten. Why am I there? He asked gently. Because you're part of our family now, she replied matter-of-factly. He had no answer to that. Over time, the foundation grew in ways it never had before. Applications were processed faster. Families were treated with more compassion. Waiting rooms were redesigned to feel less cold and clinical. Small changes, human changes. In every year, on that same November morning, they all went to the cemetery together. Richard no longer arrived alone in the dark. He walked beside Miguel. Lily held both their hands. They brought lilies and daisies. And instead of silence filled only with grief, there were stories. Stories about children who survived. About parents who smiled again. About lives rebuilt. One year, as they stood there, Lily looked up at Richard and asked, Do you think she can see us? Richard looked at the headstone, at the sunlight breaking through the clouds. I hope so, he said. I think she's happy, Lily said confidently. Because we're helping people. Richard felt a tear slip down his cheek, but this time, he didn't turn away. I think you're right, he whispered. Because sometimes, loss doesn't just take. Sometimes, it plants something new. Something unexpected. A billionaire went to his daughter's grave expecting to feel the same familiar ache. Instead, he found a janitor crying with a child, and in that fragile moment, surrounded by stone and silence, he discovered that his daughter's legacy wasn't written in marble. It was written in the heartbeat of a little girl who got to grow up. And in the quiet strength of a father who never stopped being grateful. And in a man who finally allowed his broken heart to open again. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that even the deepest pain can lead to unexpected light, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful changes begin in the most unlikely places. And sometimes healing starts with 2 crushed daisies placed gently on a grave.